Beneath the surface of our reality, there are pockets of space where the laws of physics simply cease to function. These are not merely caves or forgotten tunnels, but subterranean chambers that defy every known rule of nature. In the quiet, neglected corners of the world, these voids wait. They are pockets of stagnant time, heavy with the weight of centuries, where the air itself feels thick, like water pressing against the lungs. The silence in these places is not an absence of sound, but a physical barrier. It pushes back against anyone who dares to cross the threshold. Gravity behaves inconsistently here, pulling at the senses, while the very stone walls seem to hold a memory of things that never belonged to the surface world. The Earth does not just hold these chambers, it protects them, sealing them away from the light of the sun. Yet the boundary is thin. Deep within one such site, the darkness is absolute. A vacuum that hungers for motion. It is a place where the logic of the world above dissolves, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the abyss. Litty took the first step into the throat of the earth. The stairs were slick with a moisture that defied the dry heat of the surface. Each bootfall echoed, a sharp, rhythmic intrusion into the absolute silence of the pit. He stopped, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled a match from his pocket. He struck it against the rough stone wall. The flare of sulfur was blinding. For a heartbeat, the light danced across his face, revealing hair that caught the flame and shimmered with a faint, unnatural blue hue. The glow didn't just illuminate his features. It seemed to feed on the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows that crawled up the walls like ink. The air here was stagnant, thick with the weight of centuries, pressing against his chest with every breath he took. It tasted of ozone and ancient dust. He held the match higher, watching the flames struggle against the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The stone walls around him were not smooth. They were jagged, pulsating. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the cold breath of the abyss swirling around his ankles, waiting for him to move deeper into the dark. The match flame sputtered, the orange light shrinking until it was nothing more than a pinprick of dying heat. Litty watched the shadows retreat, reclaiming the space he had just fought to illuminate. He flicked his wrist, trying to coax the flame back to life, but the air was too heavy, too thick with a damp, suffocating stillness. The sulfur smell vanished, replaced by the scent of cold, wet stone. He stood in the absolute dark, his fingers hovering over the matchbox. A sudden shift in the air pressure against his skin stopped him cold. It was a subtle displacement, like a heavy object moving through water. He held his breath, listening. The silence was no longer empty. It had a texture, a weight that pressed against his eardrums. He felt a gaze, not from a single point, but from the very walls surrounding him. His pulse thudded in his throat, a frantic, rhythmic beat. He leaned into the suffocating weight of the abyss and whispered, "Something is down here." The silence shattered. It did not break with a sound, but with a sensation that traveled through the soles of his boots. The stone walls, previously cold and inert, began to shift. Litty pressed his palm against the surface, expecting the rough bite of granite, but his fingers sank into a texture that felt like dense, damp muscle. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through his arm, traveling up his shoulder and settling deep in his chest. The walls were not merely vibrating, they were pulsing. Deep within the masonry, a faint, bioluminescent network of veins began to glow, tracing patterns that looked like a map of a nervous system. Each pulse sent a wave of heat radiating outward, warming the stagnant air. The sound grew from a dull thud to a steady, rhythmic respiration. Litty pulled his hand away, but the wall followed the movement, the stone surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The chamber was no longer a static room, it was a living, breathing organism, and it had finally noticed him. Litty raised his left arm, relying on the steady, familiar glow of his wristband to cut through the oppressive gloom. It was his only tether to the world above, a piece of precision engineering designed to map depth and atmospheric pressure. The screen flickered, a line of blue data scrolled across the glass, then fractured into a jagged, nonsensical mess of pixels. He tapped the casing, but the device responded with a sharp, dissonant chirp that echoed unnaturally against the pulsing walls. The light on his wrist began to strobe, casting erratic, strobe-like flashes that turned the organic chamber into a series of disjointed, terrifying stills. The digital readout spun wildly, numbers blurring into symbols that defied any known language. Then, the device emitted a long, dying whine. The screen went black. The cooling fan inside the unit spun to a halt with a final metallic click. Liddy stood in the sudden, absolute darkness. His modern tools were nothing but dead weight now, useless against the ancient breathing architecture that surrounded him. Liddy moved forward, his hands outstretched, his fingers brushed against cold, unyielding timber instead of the soft, pulsating walls he had grown accustomed to. He traced the perimeter of the obstruction. It was a door, massive and imposing, set directly into the living stone. The wood was charred, blacker than the surrounding abyss, as if it had been scorched by a fire that left no ash. He ran his fingertips across the surface and recoiled. Deep, jagged gashes marred the grain, glowing with a faint neon blue energy that hummed against his skin. The heat radiating from these marks was not thermal. It was a biting electrical sting that made his nerves fire in protest. He pressed his palm against the center of the wood, and the energy surged, vibrating through his bones with a rhythmic, aggressive intensity. It felt as though the door was watching him, its surface resisting his touch with a palpable, malevolent intent. The blue light flared brighter. Liddy stood back, his breath hitching in the heavy air. He reached out again, his fingers hovering inches from the glowing scars, waiting for the inevitable breach. Liddy pressed his palm firmly against the blackened wood. The symbols etched into the frame flared with a sudden, blinding intensity. With a low, grinding groan that vibrated through the soles of his boots, the door swung inward of its own volition. He stepped across the threshold and stopped dead. The air inside felt thin, brittle, and charged with static. Before him, the room defied every law of nature. A heavy wooden chair hung suspended 3 feet off the ground, tilted at an impossible angle. A collection of rusted tools and iron chains floated in the center of the chamber, drifting slowly in a circular pattern. Liddy reached out, his fingers trembling, and nudged a floating wrench. It did not fall. It simply rotated in place. The ceiling was lost in a haze of swirling dust motes that refused to settle, hanging in the air like stars in a dead sky. He took another step, his own weight feeling suddenly light, as if the room were slowly pulling the gravity from his bones. Liddy stood motionless, the silence of the room ringing in his ears. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt like a weight against his eardrums. Then the silence broke. A faint melodic sound drifted through the chamber, a childlike humming, high-pitched and rhythmic. It was not a recording. It had the wet, breathy quality of a living throat. Liddy spun around, his boots scraping against the stone, but the room remained empty. The floating chair drifted lazily past his shoulder, the humming seemingly vibrating from the wood itself. He moved toward the center of the chamber, his eyes darting between the suspended chains in the dark corners. The sound shifted, moving behind him, then above. It was a lullaby, soft and discordant, lacking any discernible melody. He held his breath, straining to isolate the direction, but the humming was omnipresent. He reached out to grab a floating iron link, hoping to anchor himself, but his fingers passed through the metal as if it were a projection. The humming grew louder, sharper, twisting into a jagged tone. Every shadow seemed to pulse in time with the unseen voice, turning the chamber into a claustrophobic cage. The humming persisted, a thin needle of sound that seemed to pull Liddy toward the back of the chamber. He navigated through the maze of suspended debris, careful not to disturb the equilibrium of the floating objects. As he pushed past a cluster of motionless, drifting chains, the lighting in the room shifted. A single ornate lantern hung from a jagged protrusion in the ceiling, yet its shadows did not fall away from the light. Instead, they stretched toward the flame. Liddy ignored the visual distortion and focused on the object anchoring the far wall. An antique mirror. The glass did not reflect the room. It shimmered with a dull, viscous sheen, rippling rhythmically as if a stone had just been dropped into a pool of dark water. He took a cautious step forward, the floor beneath him feeling soft and yielding, like damp earth. The ripples on the mirror surface accelerated. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from the glass. The air grew frigid, smelling of ozone and stagnant dust. The ripples on the glass slowed, flattening into a polished, dark surface. Liddy leaned in, his breath hitching as the image coalesced. He saw himself, but the man in the glass was not him. The reflection was older, the skin drawn tight over bone, eyes hollowed out. Liddy tried to pull back, but his muscles locked, his gaze pinned to the glass by an invisible force. The reflection raised a hand, fingers trembling. and pressed a cracked porcelain mask against its own face. The white ceramic surface was jagged, held in place by thin, dark wires that dug into the skin. It did not move with the reflection's jaw, yet a voice emanated from behind the mask. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered. The words carried a weight of finality that made the floor beneath Liddy's boots shudder. He saw the reflection tilt its head, the mask's painted, frozen smile mocking his own terror. The reflection leaned closer, the porcelain cracking further under the pressure, and the air between them grew thin, suffocating and absolute. The warning hung in the air, a physical pressure that pushed against Liddy's chest. Before he could react, the reflection's porcelain mask split down the center. A hairline fracture appeared on the mirror's surface, spider-webbing outward with impossible speed. There was no crash of glass, no jagged shards falling to the floor. Instead, the entire frame buckled inward, the glass liquefying into a vortex of absolute black. It consumed itself, pulling the surrounding light into its center with a silent, violent hunger. The lantern hanging nearby flickered and died, its flame snuffed out as if by a sudden, massive intake of breath. Liddy stumbled backward, his boots sliding on the uneven stone, his hands clawing at the empty air for balance. The vacuum created by the implosion dragged at his skin, a cold, pulling sensation that threatened to draw him into the dark void where the mirror had stood. He hit the floor hard, his shoulders slamming into a pile of debris. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering against his ribs, but the chamber had changed. The faint humming had vanished, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the room was holding its breath. Liddy reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling as he fumbled for a new light source. He struck a match. The flare was weak, barely pushing back the oppressive weight of the room. As the light hit the floor, he saw it, his shadow, cast long and jagged against the stone. It did not stay anchored to his feet. With a sound like tearing parchment, the shadow peeled itself away from the ground. It writhed, its edges sharpening into spindly, ink-black limbs. Then, it fractured. One shadow became two, then three, each twitching with a frantic, insectile energy. They scuttled across the wall, their movements jerky and unnatural, mimicking the way a spider tests its web. Liddy backed away, his heel catching on a stone, but the shadows didn't attack. They froze. They stood in a semicircle, their elongated forms vibrating in the dim light. Every time Liddy shifted his weight, the three entities twitched in perfect, delayed unison. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the three shadows began to circle him, their movements rhythmic, patient, and predatory. The three shadows suddenly collapsed into ink-like puddles, sinking into the cracks of the stone floor as if pulled by a magnetic force. Liddy stood alone for a heartbeat, his breath hitching in the sudden silence. Then, the ground beneath his boots began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled his teeth. A hairline crack of white light split the center of the chamber, widening into a perfect, glowing circle. From the edges of this aperture, massive gears made of solid, rotating light emerged, grinding against the stone with a sound like shifting tectonic plates. They spun in opposing directions, casting long, flickering spokes of luminescence across the vaulted ceiling. As the gears reached full speed, the light intensified, burning with a sterile, clinical intensity that bleached the room of all color. A voice, layered and hollow, resonated directly within his skull. It spoke with the weight of 1,000 years. Enter to know, leave to forget. The circle pulsed, the light shifting from white to a deep, hypnotic violet. Liddy looked down. He had to decide. Liddy took a single heavy step into the center of the light. The floor vanished. He felt a violent tug at his chest, as if he were being pulled through a needle's eye, his vision blurring into streaks of gray and violet. Then, the pressure released. He stumbled forward, his boots hitting polished, cold stone. He was no longer in the chamber. He stood in the hallway that stretched into a vanishing point in both directions, the ceiling lost in a haze of shifting smoke. The walls were lined with doors, thousands of them, set into the masonry with mechanical precision. He walked to the nearest one and stopped. The wood was carved into a perfect, three-dimensional relief of his own face, but the expression was wrong. The eyes were wide, frozen in a silent scream. He moved to the next door. This one showed his face aged by decades, skin mapped with deep, jagged lines of exhaustion. He touched the surface, but it felt like ice, absorbing the heat from his fingertips. Every door held a different version of him, some weeping, some laughing, some with eyes sewn shut. The silence of the hallway shattered. From the thousands of doors, a low, discordant murmur began to rise. It started as a faint rustle, like dry leaves skittering across stone, then sharpened into distinct, overlapping voices. "Turn back," hissed the door with the weeping face. "He is waiting," croaked the door with the hollow eyes. "You are not alone," whispered a dozen doors in unison, their voices scraping against his sanity. Litty pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound bypassed his senses, vibrating directly into his skull. He stumbled, his shoulder brushing against a door carved with a face twisted in rage. The wood burned his skin like dry ice. Then he stopped. A door stood slightly ajar, the carving upon it serene, eyes closed in peaceful sleep. Litty reached out, his fingers trembling, and gripped the handle. He pushed the door open and stepped into the dark. The air on the other side was frigid, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. Litty stepped forward, his boots clicking against a floor that felt like polished ivory. He looked up, and his breath hitched. He was standing in a cathedral of impossible dimensions, its ceiling lost in a swirling, charcoal-colored gloom. The pillars were not stone. They were massive, calcified structures that twisted toward the rafters like the rib cages of leviathans. They pulsed with a faint, rhythmic luminescence, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced across the floor. He took a cautious step, the sound echoing for seconds, a sharp report that died in the vastness of the space. Every surface was textured with ridges and pores, the architecture itself appearing to have grown rather than been built. He walked toward the center, his gaze fixed on the towering pillars that seemed to lean inward, as if observing his intrusion. The scale of the place made him feel microscopic, a single spark of life caught in the throat of a dormant god. Litty moved toward the altar, his boots crunching softly on the calcified floor. The air grew dense, turning frigid enough to turn his breath into thin, white plumes. Above the dais, the shadows were no longer stagnant. They began to rotate, a slow, viscous churn that defied the laws of motion. A low, grinding sound filled the chamber, like tectonic plates shifting deep underground. The darkness above the altar thickened, pulling in the surrounding gloom. It became a swirling, oily vortex. It spun with increasing velocity, tearing at the fabric of the air itself. Litty stopped, his hand hovering near his wristband as the pressure in the room spiked. The mist began to coalesce, drawing inward to form a central, vertical mass. It was not a solid object, but a tear in reality, a hunger-given shape. Tendrils of shadow whipped outward, lashing against the bone-like pillars. The vortex pulsed, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart. He watched as the mist began to solidify, the edges of the vortex sharpening into a silhouette that loomed over the altar. The cathedral groaned under the weight of its arrival. The vortex slowed, its frantic rotation collapsing into a singular, towering presence. The black mist clung to the altar, then peeled away like shedding skin. Litty stood frozen as the form solidified into a tall, imposing silhouette. It lacked eyes, a nose, or a mouth, yet its posture radiated a predatory focus. Across its torso and limbs, thin, jagged lines of neon blue energy pulsed like a circulatory system. The light flickered, casting a harsh electric glow. Every time the blue lightning surged, the surrounding air crackled with the sound of static. The entity did not move. It did not breathe. It simply occupied the space, its presence displacing the very atmosphere of the cathedral. Litty watched the blue webbing crawl across the entity's surface. The silence was absolute now, heavier than before, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The entity tilted its head, a slow, mechanical motion. It stood motionless, a statue of darkness and electricity, towering over the altar. The blue light intensified, illuminating the cracks in the floor. It remained silent, a terrifying void waiting for the right moment to exert its will, forcing Litty to confront the sheer scale of the threat. The entity shifted. It did not step forward, but the air around it rippled as if struck by a physical blow. Then, it spoke. The sound was not a single voice, but a chorus of overlapping whispers, layered and discordant, vibrating directly against Litty's skull. It did not come from a mouth, but from the very space the creature occupied. Litty, the entity hissed, the name echoing off the twisted pillars. "You carry light. We hunger for it." The words carried a weight that made the floor beneath Liddy's boots tremble. With every syllable, the blue lightning webbing across the entity's skin flared in synchronization, casting jagged, strobe-like flashes throughout the cathedral. The temperature plummeted further, turning the moisture in the air into fine, floating ice crystals that danced in the electric glow. Liddy felt the pull of the entity's gaze, a vacuum-like sensation tugging at his chest, specifically targeting the wristband. The entity leaned down, its faceless head tilting in a predatory arc. The whispers grew sharper. The time for stillness was over. The entity lunged. It did not run. It dissolved into a mass of oily, swirling shadows that surged across the altar in a single, fluid motion. The blue lightning webbing on its skin shattered into sparks, then vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of blackness. Liddy raised his arms, but the air turned viscous, resisting his movement like thick sludge. The darkness hit him with the force of a physical impact, throwing him backward against a bone-like pillar. Above, the ceiling of the cathedral began to tear open, pouring more shadow into the chamber until the light was completely choked out. Liddy scrambled to find his footing, but the floor felt like it was dissolving into liquid ink beneath his boots. The entity was everywhere now, a wall of cold, featureless pressure pressing against his chest, his face, and his lungs. The last flickers of his wristband were swallowed, leaving him in a void where even his own breath felt stolen by the encroaching dark. Pinned against the calcified pillar, Liddy felt the cold pressure of the void tightening around his ribs. He could not see, but he could feel the pulse of the entity against his skin, a rhythmic, freezing vibration. His right hand clawed at the air, searching for the interface on his wristband. His fingers brushed the cold metal casing. He felt the familiar, jagged edge of the emergency release. He did not hesitate. He jammed his thumb into the center of the sensor, forcing a hard override. The device groaned, a high-pitched whine that cut through the suffocating silence like a serrated blade. Liddy swung his arm down with every ounce of remaining strength, slamming his fist into the floor. The impact was absolute. A blinding, golden-blue shockwave erupted from the point of contact, tearing through the oily blackness with the force of a detonated star. The darkness recoiled, shrieking as the light burned through its density. The shockwave expanded in a perfect, glowing sphere, scouring the floor. The golden blue light did not fade immediately. It clung to the surfaces, searing the air and etching the cathedral in sharp, unforgiving detail. Liddy stood, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The shockwave had done more than push the entity back. It had stripped the walls of their camouflage. Thousands of shadow figures were revealed. They were pressed against the twisted, bone-like pillars, clinging to the high arches, and crouched in every crevice of the stone. They were not moving. They were not attacking. They were simply watching. Each figure was a jagged, ink-black silhouette, their limbs elongated and hooked into the architecture like parasites. As the golden light washed over them, they did not recoil. They tightened their grip. Liddy counted dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, a sea of dark shapes. The silence returned, heavier than before, punctuated only by the faint, dry scratching of thousands of claws against stone. He realized then that the entity was not a single commander, but the focal point of a swarm. They were waiting for the light to die. He watched his wristband, the golden glow dimming, and saw the figures nearest to him shift their heads in perfect, terrifying unison. The odds were no longer a battle, they were a siege. The cathedral did not just crumble, it folded. The bone-like pillars groaned, the sound of snapping calcium echoing through the chamber as they bent toward the center. Liddy stumbled as the floor beneath him tilted at a sharp, impossible angle. Gravity seemed to lose its grip, pulling him toward the shifting walls. The stone ceiling began to spiral, segments of it detaching and spinning into a central point of darkness. He dug his heels into the floor, but the surface was liquefying, turning into a viscous, gray sludge that pulled at his boots. Above him, the arches twisted like wet clay, the architecture tearing itself apart in a rhythmic, grinding roar. He watched as the altar vanished, consumed by the folding geometry of the room. The air grew thin, vibrating with the friction of collapsing space. Every surface he touched felt hot, buzzing with the energy of reality being unmade. He scrambled toward a ledge that remained momentarily stable. He looked up, his lungs burning, as the entire structure began to rotate, creating a funnel of stone and shadow that threatened to crush everything. The center of the room vanished into a roaring maw of shadow. Liddy braced himself against a tilting slab of masonry, his eyes darting across the chaotic geometry. Then, a fracture appeared in the air, a jagged, brilliant line of white. It widened, spilling blinding radiance into the gloom. A staircase of pure, solidified light erupted from the void, its steps hovering in the empty space where the floor had been. He did not hesitate. He lunged, his boots barely catching the edge of the first step as the stone behind him dissolved into dust. The staircase hummed with a high-pitched electric vibration that rattled his teeth. He climbed, his muscles screaming, legs pumping in a desperate rhythm. Below him, the cathedral was being shredded. Pillars shattered into fine powder, and the shadow figures were swept into the vortex like leaves in a gale. The staircase flickered, the light dimming as the structural integrity of the room failed. He leaped over a gap where a step had already vanished into the abyss. The ceiling descended, a crushing weight of stone and shadow, closing the distance with every stride he took. He reached for the final, highest point of the light. The exit loomed ahead, a rectangular frame of heavy wood suspended within the collapsing light. Litty threw his weight forward, his fingers hooking into the frame to haul himself through the gap. Behind him, the vortex roared, a sound of grinding stone and tearing air that pulled at his heels like a physical hand. He felt the vacuum of the void dragging him back, the pressure of the collapsing reality pushing against his spine. He kicked out, his boots striking the solid frame of the door, and launched his body into the narrow space. Just as his shoulders cleared the threshold, the wood of the doorframe shivered. It slammed shut with a force that shook the surrounding foundation. A violent, neon blue flash erupted from the seams of the door, a final discharge of energy that seared the air. The vibration ceased instantly. He lay still, his chest heaving, as the last traces of the blue glow faded. Litty pushed himself up from the floorboards, his palms scraping against the rough, cold wood. He crawled toward the narrow gap of the basement entrance, his movement stiff and heavy. He reached the threshold and pulled himself out into the open. The night air hit him like a physical blow, sharp and biting against his sweat-drenched skin. He collapsed onto the grass, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven bursts. Above him, the sky was a vast, indifferent expanse of black, devoid of the pulsing, unnatural light he had just left behind. He rolled onto his back, staring at the distant, steady stars. The silence of the world was absolute. He reached up, his fingers trembling as he wiped the grit from his face. Every breath felt like a luxury. He stood, his legs shaking, and took a step away from the sight. The ground under his boots felt solid, real, and blessedly still. He did not look back again. Litty raised his left arm. The wristband, once a steady beacon of navigation and data, was now a dull, unresponsive band of plastic. He tapped the glass screen, but no light flickered. The device was not merely broken, it was hollowed out, drained of every microamp of power. He pressed his thumb against the casing, feeling the faint, residual warmth of the energy that had been siphoned away. The entity had not just attacked him, it had fed on the very tools he used to define his reality. He looked back at the basement entrance, now just a shadow against the dark terrain. The air around the structure felt thinner, as if the space itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next source of illumination to wander too close. He rubbed his forearm, where the skin still tingled with a phantom charge. The hunger of the thing below was not satisfied. It was merely dormant, coiled in the dark, waiting for the next pulse of energy to wake it. He turned his back on the site, walking toward the tree line. Every step away felt like a gamble, as if the darkness behind him were reaching out. Litty stopped at the edge of the clearing. He turned his head, his eyes fixed on the basement door. The wood was silent now, the claw marks no longer glowing with that impossible neon heat. He watched the frame, waiting for a sound, a shift, or a sign that the entity was truly gone. Nothing moved. Then, a single, thin line of blue light bled from the gap between the door and the frame, pulsing once before vanishing. He did not move closer. He understood now that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and some truths are not meant to be held. The knowledge he had gained was a weight, a burden of understanding that he would carry long after he left this place. He turned away, his boots crunching on the dry grass, and walked toward the horizon. Behind him, the basement door remained, sealed. The world settled back into its natural rhythm, indifferent to the anomaly buried beneath the soil. He did not look back again. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some secrets are safer when they remain forever in the shadows.